this lecture, I'd like to give a synopsis of Schopenhauer's main philosophical work, The World as Will and Representation, from 1819. Section 1. It's the Count. But before we begin, I'd like to get something off my chest. Schopenhauer was a striking-looking man, with his 19th century high-collared shirt and topcoat, with those piercing, mischievous eyes that gaze straight at you from the depths of time, with his crazy hair, and with his evident overall sense of self-presentation. Here he is in 1846 at 58 years of age. And here he is again a few years later in 1852 at 64. It's definitely a look. It's the good-natured, highly intelligent 19th century troublemaker look. And it may seem in a way oddly familiar to you. If so, you're not alone. It was bugging me for a while, but I finally figured it out. Arthur Schopenhauer is the Count Olaf of 19th century philosophy. Make of it what you will. Section 2. Publication History. The World as Will and Representation is Schopenhauer's masterpiece, published in 1819 when its author was only 30 years old. It is the natural development of the philosophical project of Schopenhauer's doctoral dissertation on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason from 1813. The book did not win him immediate fame, but was instead mostly ignored by the thoroughly Fichtean and Hegelian German philosophical establishment at the time. In 1844, Schopenhauer published a second edition in which he basically changed nothing in the text of the first edition because, as he says, I wanted to guard against spoiling the work of my earlier years by the carping criticism of old age. Instead of changing his youthful output, the 56-year-old Schopenhauer added a whole new second volume consisting of really useful essays and commentary on the topics of the first volume. Their aim is, quote, to work through all the parts of the system with that completeness, thoroughness, and fullness which are attained only by many years of meditation on it. In Schopenhauer's vision, the two volumes thus supplement each other. But at the time of the second edition in the 1840s, Schopenhauer was also a little bitter because his magnum opus had now been ignored by the philosophical establishment for a quarter century. Fortunately, by the 1850s, that started to change, and Schopenhauer began to be recognized as the giant of 19th century German philosophy that he was. So, in 1859, 1 year before his death, a third edition was published. In it, Schopenhauer makes poignant reference to this recent recognition. If I also have at last arrived and have the satisfaction at the end of my life of seeing the beginning of my influence, it is with the hope that, according to an old rule, it will last longer in proportion to the lateness of its beginning. Section 3. Influence. Well, that certainly panned out. Schopenhauer's influence ran deep, far, and wide. His philosophy was not only proto-Darwinian, and there's an argument to be made that Darwin knew of Schopenhauer. After all, Schopenhauer's growing fame dates to the 1850s, and the year of the publication of the third edition of The World as Will and Representation, 1859, was also the year of the original publication of On the Origin of Species. At any rate, as far as acknowledged influence is concerned, Schopenhauer's work made important impressions on philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and Max Horkheimer, on composers like Richard Wagner, Johannes Brahms, Gustav Mahler, and Arnold Schoenberg, on writers like Leon Tolstoy, Marcel Proust, Thomas Mann, and José Luis Borges, on poets like Rainer Maria Rilke, and even on scholars of comparative religion like Joseph Campbell. Section 4, The World. Now, as the title suggests, in The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer argues for the idea that the world can, and indeed must, be considered in two fundamentally different but related ways, as will and as representation. If you Google the world, the first thing that pops up are images of planet Earth. And a map of the world is a map of our planet. But Schopenhauer, of course, meant something much bigger than that by the world. Something more like the totality of all existing things, or reality as a whole. Schopenhauer's basic claim is that there are, and in fact he'll argue that there must be, two sides to everything, a visible or observable side, and an underlying unobservable quote-unquote inner side. As we'll see, an unobservable side isn't really a side, but let's put that to the side for now. No pun. Metaphysically speaking, the idea that the world, or reality as such, can be looked at in two different ways, as this and as that, as will and as representation, makes Schopenhauer's philosophy a kind of dual aspect monism. One world, that's the monism, two ways of looking at it, that's the dual aspect. He calls the inner unobservable dimension will because the only, if indirect and limited, access I have to it is in and through my own experience of myself as a driven, energetic being. My will and willing, and more to the point, the experience of the frustration of my will and willing, are what open up a different perspective on everything to me. And Schopenhauer argues, just as I have this inner dimension in myself, so must everything else. Section 5, First Person and Third Person. So I am not just a passive receptive observer of the world around me or of my own fate in it. I am an active, dynamic participant in it. I suffer, I struggle, I fail, I succeed. Now, you too, of course, suffer and struggle, fail or succeed. But there's a difference between our struggles, and that difference, Schopenhauer will explain, is the difference between will and representation. First, though, let's focus on the similarities. In philosophy today, and in gaming, we sometimes speak of a first-person perspective as opposed to a third-person perspective on the world. An inside view and an outside view, if you will. That gets us in Schopenhauer's ballpark, but it's not quite the difference between will and representation Schopenhauer is trying to get us to see. Yes, first-person perspectives and third-person perspectives, the way things look to me as opposed to the way things, including myself, look to you, or from the outside, are two different ways of looking or two different species of perspective. But they are generically the same. They are both ways of looking. They are both perspectives. So when I observe my struggle from the inside, I observe it in fundamentally the same way as you do when you observe my struggle, even if I got the inside scoop. I can recount the steps I took, the challenges I overcame, how that made me feel, and so on and so forth. Even the things that only I know, the things that are publicly unknown only until I tell all. They may only be privately observable, but they are observable. And being observable, they are recountable, shareable, and so publicly knowable, even if not actually publicly known. To the extent that my struggle as observed by me is recountable, shareable, and knowable, my struggle as observed by me is not fundamentally different from my struggle as observed by you. They are the same kind of thing. Section 6, Autobiography and Biography. Think about the difference between biography, the story of a life as told in artifacts, records, letters, interviews, etc. by someone else from a third-person perspective, and autobiography, the story of that same life as told by the person who lived it from a first-person perspective. The autobiography may be more personal and insightful, and perhaps also more delusional, dishonest, and so in its own way revealing, but at the core, they are the same kind of thing. stories of a life based on publicly or privately accessible information. The third person and first person perspectives, as I have described them, differ principally in the amount or quantity of information they can access. I know more about my life than you do, but at bottom it's all just information. Accordingly, Schopenhauer, if he'd had those terms, would lump the first person perspective together with the third person perspective as versions of the world as representation. Section 7. Drowning. Now, Schopenhauer's fundamental point in the world as will and representation is that these perspectives are not exhaustive. That's because, in my own case, I'm simply not limited to a storytelling perspective on myself. I am connected to my life in a way that is fundamentally different from the good or bad copy it makes. I am connected to my own life in a way that does not simply provide more information about me than you have. What makes my relation to my life different from your relation to my life is not simply that I can observe myself as if I were my own little guardian angel always watching on, or as if I sat on the director's cut of my own life, whereas you only get the theatrical release. I am connected in a fundamentally different way. Schopenhauer puts it this way. The transition from the world as mere representation of the knowing subject to whatever it may be besides this would never be found if the investigator himself were nothing more than the pure knowing subject, a winged cherub without a body. But he is himself rooted in that world. He finds himself in it as an individual. That is to say, his knowledge, which is the necessary supporter of the whole world as representation, is yet always given through the medium of a body, whose affections are, as we have shown, the starting point for the understanding in the perception of that world. Schopenhauer likes to express this by using the Latin phrase that this way of being connected to my life is toto genere different from the perspective of an observer, even if that observer is me. The emphasis here is on genere, that is to say, on the genus, or kind. Schopenhauer's point is that my access to myself is not simply quantitatively, but qualitatively different from yours. It's not just more of the same kind of information, but a totally different kind of information. This non-representational dimension of our lives is intimately connected to the fact of our embodiment. Schopenhauer says, our body appears in consciousness in quite another way, toto genere different from representation, and this we denote by the word will. So what's that non-representational dimension of the world, so different from our representational or theoretical relation to the world? To put it simply and bluntly, it's the difference between me drowning you and you drowning me. The idea is that through the experience of my body being connected to life, and especially through the experience of having that connection threatened, I see that there is more to existence than merely what I can observe, recount, share, or know. While I do observe myself, I also experience myself in a visceral, throbbing, dynamic way. And that is a connection to a deeper, more fundamental level of existence than what mere representation can reach or attest. Schopenhauer will say that my will to live is evidence of that dynamic connection and that deeper level. And if you hear echoes in this will to live of Darwin's struggle for existence, side note, Darwin never actually spoke of the survival of the fittest, or of Nietzsche's will to power, you'd be on the right track. Section 8. Two problems. Philosophically, though, this non-representational, will-related dimension of the world isn't all that easy to carve out. How do you represent an inherently non-representational aspect of the world? Schopenhauer faces two immediate problems. First, while it may make sense to say that I am a living, dynamic, driven being with a willing dimension to my existence, fundamentally toto genere different from my objective, empirically observable self, and while it may even make sense to say that you are such a being too, even as I'll never have anything like immediate insight into that, it's a whole different claim to say that the world, or literally everything in the universe, has a dimension that is meaningfully of a piece with this willing side of me. Surely this rock over here doesn't have a will. Second, even in my own case, it's not clear that my experience of myself as will, based as it is on the living, dynamic, driven experience of my individual embodied struggles in a material world, is all that non representational. Schopenhauer is perfectly open about this. Specifically, while my experience of myself as will is different from other representations in that it is not an experience of an object in space, and therefore also not an experience that can meaningfully be described as causal, my experience of myself as will is, just like all other representational experiences, extended in time. Nor is it particularly different from my other inner first personal representations like thoughts, perceptions, and so forth. They too are in time, but not in space. But if those are not non representational just because they're not in space, then why is willing and will supposed to be uniquely non representational? Section 9: Idealism. Starting with the first problem, Schopenhauer does not believe that ordinary inanimate objects have little souls with their own aims or desires, but he does think that there must be an inner side to everything, and that our own experience as living creatures is A, dispositive proof of just that, as well as B, a guide to how that dimension might be understood, namely as dynamic and productive. Schopenhauer's argument starts with an area of agreement between his own and idealist principles, specifically with Berkeleian idealism, a view that has since fallen out of fashion, if not necessarily because it has been disproven. Schopenhauer's basic idea is that for any kind of object, to be an object, logically and metaphysically presupposes there to be a subject, for which it is an object. Berkeley captures this by saying esse est percipi, or to be is to be perceived. Objective existence just is subjective perception. This corresponds to the representational dimension of Schopenhauer's metaphysics. To say that the world is representation is very much to say that objective existence just is subjective perception. We saw a related idea in Hegel's characterization in section 82 of the Introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit of the object or the this or the thing as simultaneously being in itself and being for another. The idea of an object that is not for a subject, the idea of an absolutely mind-independent object, is on this view either a contradiction in terms or based on a misunderstanding of the meaning of words. Schopenhauer differs from Berkeley and other idealists because he does not think that the world is only representation. To be may be to be perceived, but it is not only to be perceived. Schopenhauer's reason is that such a view would lead to the absurd consequence that the world would vanish in its entirety the moment a given perceiver vanishes. You'd want to say that their world vanishes, sure, but not that the world writ large does. Schopenhauer puts it this way: yet the perceived object must be something in itself, and not merely something for others, for otherwise it would be positively only representation, and we should have an absolute idealism that in the end would become theoretical egoism, in which all reality disappears and the world becomes a mere subjective phantasm. Berkeley escaped this absurd consequence only because in his theologically tinged philosophy, God, the divine perceiver, holds all perceptions in place, so to speak, so nothing ever vanishes out of existence. That road is not open to Schopenhauer, who is a principled atheist, despite some grudging respect for Christianity's view of life as torment. To ward off the absurd consequence of theoretical egoism in the absence of a perceiver God is to conclude that the world must be something besides representation. Hence the title. Of course, starting as we do from representation, as knowing subjects, there'd be nothing to license the conclusion that the world is something besides representation. Schopenhauer says, starting from representation, we shall never get beyond the representation, i.e., the phenomenon. Except that there is this other truth, that we are not merely the knowing subject, but that we ourselves are also among those realities or entities we require to know. that we ourselves are the thing in itself. So we are, in a sense, already at the finish line. We already know from our own case that there is more to the world than mere representation. Again, we're not merely receptive perceivers of, we are eager participants in the business of the world. Here, therefore, lies the datum alone capable of becoming the key to everything else, or, as I have said, the only narrow gateway to truth. Section 10, Will. But this leads us to the second problem mentioned above. In what way is this datum, this gateway to truth, non-representational? On one level, Schopenhauer concedes that the datum is not fully non-representational. That's a bit of a surprise, given that the title of the book seems to say, and Schopenhauer's insistence that the will is toto genere different explicitly does say, that will has nothing to do with representation. So, does it or doesn't it? The gateway image may be instructive here. We know that there's an underside to things. We feel it inside us. But we're trapped on our side, so to speak. Still, the signs are real, and being in our body is the closest we can get. Schopenhauer says, lastly, the knowledge which I have of my will, though it is immediate, cannot be separated from that which I have of my body. I know my will, not as a whole, not as a unity, not completely according to its nature, but I know it only in its particular acts, and therefore in time, which is the form of the phenomenal aspect of my body, as of every object. Therefore, the body is a condition of the knowledge of my will. But granting that the world is my will in addition to representation, and that knowledge of my will saves me from theoretical egoism, I now have a new problem. Everything I do stands in the service of my will. I will move heaven and earth to find my will, and yet I live in an impossible situation. I can never fully attain my will. I am frustrated at every turn. Still, nothing will stop me trying and failing to attain it. The good news is that I am no mere disengaged spectator. I am an active participant, but I am actively suffering with seemingly no way out. So, is there any hope for salvation? Schopenhauer will say, yes, indeed there is.